the cruelest victories are the ones celebrated too soon. The ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers that scattered warm light across polished marble floors, where every smile looked brighter through the lens of expensive cameras and every laugh echoed just a little louder than it needed to. A string quartet drifted through the room with a familiar love song, while servers in crisp black suits carried silver trays filled with champagne flutes that caught the light like tiny stars. It was the kind of wedding people talked about for months, the kind where every centerpiece looked handcrafted, every flower had been flown in overnight, and every guest arrived believing they were witnessing the beginning of a perfect future. Ethan Carter adjusted the sleeve of his tailored tuxedo and rested a confident hand against Madison Harper's back as they entered the reception hall. Madison looked flawless in an elegant emerald dress, her smile effortless as she greeted guests who turned immediately to admire the attractive couple. Ethan welcomed every glance, every whispered compliment, every nod from old friends who had once doubted him. He had worked hard to build this image, and tonight he intended to enjoy every second of it. But beneath his polished smile lived another reason for coming. It had nothing to do with the bride or groom. His eyes swept across the ballroom, lingering over every table, every familiar face, searching for one woman. Audrey Sinclair. His ex-wife. The woman he had convinced himself belonged to another chapter of his life. The woman he expected to walk into this room alone. He imagined how the evening would unfold before it had even begun. She would arrive quietly, perhaps wearing something simple, offering polite congratulations before finding a seat near the back. She would notice him beside Madison. She would see the diamond ring sparkling beneath the chandeliers. She would understand without a single word that he had moved on, that his life had become larger, brighter, more successful than the one they had shared. At least, that was the story Ethan wanted everyone to believe. A few former co-workers drifted toward him with easy smiles and firm handshakes. They congratulated him on his recent promotion, complimented Madison, and laughed about old memories. One of them casually asked whether Audrey had confirmed her invitation. Ethan shrugged with practiced indifference, though the corner of his mouth lifted into the faintest smile. "If she comes," he said lightly, "I hope she's doing well." The words sounded gracious. His expression suggested something else entirely. Madison glanced up at him. "You really think she'll show?" she asked. Ethan lifted his champagne glass. Curiosity has a funny way of bringing people back. Around them, conversations blended into a pleasant hum. The bride's parents welcomed arriving guests. Cameras flashed near the floral arch somewhere across the ballroom, children laughed as they chased each other between empty chairs before being gently called back by their parents. Everything felt perfectly arranged, perfectly timed. Ethan checked his watch without realizing it. 7:15. She was late. He almost smiled to himself. Maybe she had decided staying home was easier than facing him. Maybe she had finally accepted that the life they once dreamed about now belonged to someone else. The thought settled comfortably inside him. He raised his glass again just as the quartet softened into another melody. Then the massive wooden doors at the entrance slowly began to open. The conversations nearest the entrance faded first. Then the laughter. Then even the musicians seemed quieter beneath the weight of dozens of turning heads. Ethan followed every curious gaze toward the doorway, expecting nothing more than the arrival of another guest. Instead, for the first time that evening, the confidence he had worn so effortlessly began to crack. Every conversation inside the ballroom seemed to pause for a heartbeat as the entrance doors continued to swing open, yet Audrey Sinclair was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the empty doorway became a mirror that reflected memories Ethan Carter had spent years trying to rewrite. Long before tailored tuxedos, luxury watches, and polished business dinners became part of his life, there had been two people sharing a tiny apartment above an aging hardware store in a quiet Ohio neighborhood. The walls had been thin enough to hear the neighbors arguing, the heater had rattled every winter night, and the kitchen had barely enough room for two people to stand together without bumping shoulders. Audrey had never complained. She believed difficult seasons were temporary as long as two people kept choosing each other. Every morning before sunrise she left for work carrying a travel mug filled with homemade coffee while Ethan stayed behind preparing presentations, business proposals, and job applications that rarely received replies. Whenever another rejection arrived, she smiled with the same quiet confidence and reminded him that success usually knocked after people had almost given up listening. She worked extra shifts without telling him, quietly setting aside every additional dollar so they could keep paying rent on time. When his old sedan finally stopped running, Audrey sold a necklace that had belonged to her grandmother to cover the repair bill. Ethan had protested for exactly 5 minutes before accepting the money. At the time, he promised himself he would repay every sacrifice once his career finally took off. They celebrated the smallest victories because there was little else to celebrate. A discounted pizza on Friday nights. A second-hand couch they found online. A handwritten note Audrey slipped into his briefcase before an important interview that simply read, "You are already enough, even before the world notices." Ethan kept that note in his wallet for years. Then everything changed faster than either of them expected. A growing technology company offered him an opportunity that seemed almost impossible to refuse. The salary tripled within 18 months. New clients arrived. Promotions followed. Expensive dinners replaced frozen meals. Business flights replaced weekend walks through neighborhood parks. Audrey watched his confidence grow, but somewhere along the way, gratitude slowly disappeared behind ambition. Conversations became shorter. Business calls interrupted dinners. Weekend plans gave way to networking events where Audrey often felt invisible beside people discussing investments she had never heard of. Ethan began introducing her less frequently, as though she belonged to a chapter of his life that no longer matched the future he imagined. When Audrey gently asked whether they were drifting apart, he insisted she was overthinking everything. Yet his eyes rarely met hers anymore. The distance between them was no longer measured in miles or money. It lived inside every unfinished conversation and every silent drive home. One rainy evening, after another cancelled anniversary dinner, Ethan placed divorce papers on their kitchen table with the same careful precision he once used while organizing business contracts. He said they had grown into different people. He said neither of them was truly happy anymore. He even thanked her for believing in him when nobody else had. Audrey listened without raising her voice. She looked at the papers, then at the man she had spent years helping build, and quietly realized she no longer recognized him. She signed her name with steady hands, folded the pen, wished him well, and walked away carrying only a single suitcase and the quiet dignity that no courtroom could divide. As the memory faded beneath the sparkling lights of the wedding reception, Ethan tightened his grip around his champagne glass. He had spent years convincing himself that leaving Audrey had simply been another practical decision. Yet as every eye remained fixed on the entrance, an unfamiliar feeling settled beneath his confidence, as though the past had finally decided it was finished waiting outside. The silence surrounding the entrance lasted only a few seconds before ordinary conversations slowly returned, but Ethan Carter could not shake the strange weight pressing against his thoughts. He told himself he was imagining things. Audrey Sinclair had always been punctual. If she had not walked through those doors yet, perhaps she had changed her mind. Perhaps she had realized attending this wedding would only remind her of everything she had lost. That explanation satisfied him for exactly one breath before another memory surfaced, one he rarely allowed himself to revisit. 3 weeks earlier, the invitation list had landed. In his inbox after the bride asked several mutual friends to help reconnect with former classmates. Ethan noticed Audrey's name immediately. Instead of ignoring it, he quietly asked whether her mailing address was still current. Nobody questioned the request. Everyone assumed he was simply being polite. The truth was much different. Ethan wanted her there. He wanted her to see him standing beside Madison Harper. He wanted her to witness the polished version of the man she had once believed in before anyone else did. Somewhere deep inside, beyond his confidence and carefully rehearsed smiles, lived a need that ambition had never erased. He wanted confirmation that leaving Audrey had been the right decision. He believed seeing her alone would finally silence every lingering doubt. When Madison discovered that Audrey had been invited, she looked surprised but not concerned. She asked whether it might make the evening uncomfortable. Ethan laughed softly and assured her there was nothing to worry about. He described Audrey as kind, quiet, and long finished with the past. Madison accepted his explanation without hesitation, trusting the man she planned to marry. She never realized that Ethan had checked the guest list twice that week just to make certain one particular name remained printed beside a reserved seat near the center of the ballroom. Even now, that empty chair rested beneath soft golden light, waiting for someone who had not yet appeared. Across the room, two former co-workers exchanged quiet whispers while glancing toward Ethan. One smiled politely before saying, almost under his breath, that Audrey had always deserved happiness after everything she had done for him years ago. The other simply nodded. Their words never reached Ethan directly, yet the expressions on their faces carried enough meaning to make him look away. He immediately found another conversation, another handshake, another compliment about his career. Applause from nearby guests welcomed the newly married couple as they greeted relatives one table at a time, but Ethan barely noticed. His attention continued drifting toward the entrance every few moments, as though he were waiting for an unfinished conversation instead of another guest. Madison slipped her hand through his arm and smiled warmly. She complimented the decorations, admired the music, and spoke excitedly about their own upcoming wedding plans. Ethan answered with practiced charm, yet each response arrived a little slower than the last. Something felt unfinished, and he could not explain why. Then one of the event coordinators hurried toward the entrance after receiving a message through an earpiece. The ballroom doors opened once more, wider than before. Several guests instinctively turned their heads. A cool evening breeze slipped inside, carrying the faint scent of summer rain from outside the venue. Every conversation softened again. Ethan lifted his eyes toward the doorway with the quiet certainty that this time, Audrey Sinclair had finally arrived. The figure who stepped through the doorway was Audrey Sinclair, but she was nothing like the woman Ethan Carter had imagined during the past several weeks. She did not arrive wearing a designer gown chosen to impress strangers or jewelry that demanded attention. Instead, she wore a timeless navy blue dress that reflected quiet confidence rather than wealth, its elegant simplicity standing out against the glitter surrounding the ballroom. Her posture was relaxed. Her smile was gentle. She carried herself with the calm certainty of someone who no longer needed the approval of anyone waiting inside that room. For a brief moment, Ethan felt something close to relief. She had come alone after all. The story he had rehearsed inside his mind seemed ready to unfold exactly as planned. Madison Harper leaned slightly closer and whispered, asking if that was Audrey. Ethan nodded almost automatically, unable to look away. Audrey greeted the bride's parents with genuine warmth before handing them a neatly wrapped gift. She paused to congratulate the newly married couple, exchanging quiet words that brought sincere smiles to their faces. There was no hesitation in her movements and no sign of discomfort. She looked completely at ease, as though walking into a room filled with memories carried no greater weight than stepping into an ordinary evening celebration. Several guests recognized her immediately. Old friends welcomed her with hugs and warm laughter. A former co-worker thanked her for helping him years earlier when he had struggled through a difficult season. Even people who had not seen her since the divorce seemed naturally drawn toward her quiet presence. Audrey listened more than she spoke, asking about families, children, and careers with genuine curiosity. She remembered names. She remembered birthdays. She remembered details that many people forgot. Ethan noticed something that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Nobody looked at Audrey with pity. They looked at her with respect. Across the ballroom, one elderly woman reached for Audrey's hands and smiled with unmistakable affection before introducing her to relatives who had never met her. The conversation lasted only a minute, yet the warmth surrounding Audrey seemed impossible to ignore. Ethan had expected awkward silence, sympathetic glances, perhaps even visible regret. Instead, she appeared completely free from the invisible burden he had imagined she would still be carrying. Madison studied Audrey quietly before speaking again. She admitted that Audrey seemed much different than she expected. Ethan forced a small laugh and answered that people learn to hide disappointment over time. Even as he said the words, they sounded less convincing than before. Audrey accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and took her place near one side of the ballroom, where soft golden light from the chandeliers reflected against the polished floor. She checked the time on her watch but showed no sign of impatience. Her expression remained peaceful, almost expectant, as though she knew someone important was still on the way. Ethan watched her glance briefly toward the entrance before returning her attention to a conversation with the bride's aunt. It was a simple movement, barely noticeable to anyone else, yet it planted an unexpected question inside his mind. She was not looking back at the past. She was waiting for the future to walk through the door. Before he could dismiss the thought, the event coordinator hurried toward the entrance once again. This time, another member of the staff straightened the red carpet leading into the ballroom, and several attendants quietly stepped aside, preparing for the arrival of someone they clearly recognized. The ballroom grew unexpectedly still as a sleek black luxury sedan came to a smooth stop beneath the covered entrance outside. Nobody inside could see the vehicle clearly, but the subtle change in the staff's behavior was impossible to miss. Two attendants quietly opened the front doors together instead of one. The event coordinator straightened her jacket and stepped forward with a respectful smile that seemed unusually sincere. Even the valet, who had spent the evening greeting guests with practiced efficiency, stood a little taller as someone emerged from the car. Audrey Sinclair noticed the movement before anyone else did. She did not rush forward. She did not wave. Instead, a quiet smile softened her face, the kind of smile that appeared naturally when someone important finally arrived safely. Ethan Carter followed her gaze without realizing he had stopped listening to Madison Harper. Every instinct told him to expect someone extraordinary, yet the man who entered looked almost surprisingly understated. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit without any flashy details. His watch was elegant but understated. There were no security guards surrounding him, no dramatic entrance, no attempt to command attention. He simply thanked the valet with genuine appreciation before walking toward the ballroom doors with calm, measured steps. As he entered the reception hall, his first reaction was not to scan the room or admire the decorations. His eyes searched only for Audrey. The moment he found her, his expression warmed in a way that could not be rehearsed. Audrey walked toward him with the same quiet confidence she had carried all evening. They met halfway across the entrance without embracing dramatically or drawing attention to themselves. Instead, he smiled and gently asked whether she had been waiting long. Audrey answered with a light laugh, saying only that he had arrived exactly when he promised. There was an ease between them. That came from trust rather than performance. He accepted the folded program she had been holding for him, thanked her softly, and allowed her to lead the way toward the reception. Ethan watched every small gesture with growing confusion. The stranger never walked ahead of Audrey. He never interrupted her conversations. When guests greeted them, he waited patiently until Audrey finished speaking before introducing himself. If someone addressed him first, he naturally included Audrey in the conversation, making certain she was never left standing alone. It was a quiet kind of respect that Ethan had not noticed because he had never looked for it before. Madison observed the interaction with genuine curiosity. "He seems very kind," she whispered. Ethan forced a brief smile. "Probably just a friend," he replied, although the answer felt less certain the moment he spoke it aloud. Across the ballroom, the bride's father approached the newcomer with a broad smile and thanked him warmly for making time to attend despite what sounded like an extremely busy schedule. The man apologized politely for arriving later than expected because a business meeting outside the city had taken longer than planned. His voice remained calm, his tone humble, and after only a few seconds he redirected the conversation back towards celebrating the newly married couple instead of discussing himself. Audrey listened quietly beside him, occasionally exchanging knowing smiles that suggested countless ordinary moments shared far away from elegant ballrooms and expensive celebrations. They looked comfortable together, not because they were trying to impress anyone, but because silence between them never seemed uncomfortable. Ethan tightened his grip around his glass once again. He still did not know the man's name, his profession, or why several guests appeared unexpectedly delighted by his arrival. Yet one uncomfortable truth had already become impossible to ignore. Whoever this man was, Audrey was no longer the lonely woman Ethan had imagined when he mailed that invitation, and for the first time since the evening began, he found himself wondering whether he had completely misunderstood the story he thought he controlled. The reception settled into an easy rhythm as dinner was served, yet an invisible tension lingered beneath the music, known only to one man who could no longer focus on the celebration around him. Ethan Carter smiled whenever someone approached his table, but his attention drifted back to Audrey Sinclair again and again. She never once searched the room for him. She never looked toward the table where he and Madison Harper were seated. She laughed naturally with old friends, thanked the servers by name whenever they refilled her glass, and seemed completely present in the moment. The stranger beside her remained just as composed. He listened more than he spoke, occasionally leaning closer whenever Audrey shared a quiet comment that made both of them smile. There was no performance between them, no attempt to convince anyone they were happy. They simply were. That quiet certainty unsettled Ethan more than any dramatic display ever could. Madison noticed his distraction. She gently touched his arm and asked whether everything was all right. Ethan answered immediately that he was only thinking about work, but even he could hear how unconvincing his voice sounded. Across the ballroom, Audrey excused herself for a moment to congratulate the bride once more before returning to the table where the mysterious gentleman waited. He stood as she approached, pulled out her chair without making a show of it, then sat only after she was comfortable. The gesture lasted no more than a few seconds, yet it revealed years of quiet respect rather than polished manners learned for public appearances. Ethan remembered countless evenings when Audrey had quietly set the dinner table for both of them after working long shifts, while he answered emails without looking up. He could not remember the last time he had pulled out a chair for her or even thanked her for the little things she had done every single day. The realization disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived, buried beneath the excuse that people simply changed. The master of ceremonies announced that several close friends and family members would soon be invited to offer short congratulations to the newly married couple. Guests applauded warmly while servers cleared the dinner plates. As conversations resumed, the bride walked personally to Audrey's table with an affectionate smile. She greeted Audrey first, then warmly thanked the gentleman beside her for coming despite what she described as an incredibly demanding schedule. He responded with genuine humility, insisting that celebrating people he cared about would always deserve time on his calendar. The bride laughed and gently squeezed Audrey's hand before returning to the stage. Ethan caught every word, although he still knew almost nothing about the man himself. He only knew that people treated him with effortless respect rather than exaggerated admiration. No one appeared intimidated. No one tried to impress him. They simply seemed genuinely pleased that he had accepted the invitation. That distinction lingered in Ethan's thoughts. Wealth could attract attention, but respect usually had to be earned over many years. He glanced toward the empty place card resting beside Audrey's plate, finally noticing the elegant lettering that had been hidden beneath a folded napkin throughout dinner. The first name became visible as the candlelight shifted across the table. It read, Alexander. Ethan quietly repeated the name to himself, searching his memory without success. Madison followed his gaze and asked whether he knew him. Ethan slowly shook his head. No, he answered, forcing another polite smile, but I have a feeling everyone else does. At that exact moment, another guest hurried across the ballroom with unmistakable excitement after recognizing Alexander from a distance, and before Ethan could look away, he realized the evening was about to reveal a truth he had never expected to hear. The guest who had hurried across the ballroom reached Alexander with unmistakable excitement and extended his hand with both of his own. Alexander, I did not realize you were coming tonight, he said warmly. It has been far too long. Alexander returned the handshake with an easy smile and asked about the man's family before anything else. Their conversation lasted less than a minute, yet by the time it ended, 2 more guests had quietly approached to greet him. None of them raised their voices. None of them treated him like a celebrity. They greeted him with the comfortable familiarity reserved for someone whose reputation had been earned rather than advertised. Ethan Carter watched from across the room, unable to hide his curiosity any longer. Madison Harper followed his gaze. "You really have no idea who he is?" she asked softly. Ethan shook his head. "No. But apparently everyone else does." The music shifted into a slower melody as guests began gathering near the dance floor. Conversations blended together again, yet Ethan found himself paying attention only to Audrey Sinclair's table. He noticed how naturally Alexander included everyone in every conversation. Whenever someone complimented him, he redirected the praise toward another person. Whenever someone thanked him for attending, he reminded them that the evening belonged to the bride and groom. There was no trace of arrogance, only a quiet confidence that never demanded attention. Ethan felt an unfamiliar irritation growing beneath his carefully composed smile. He picked up another glass of sparkling water and leaned toward Madison. "Come on," he said lightly. "We should go say hello. It would be awkward not to." Madison agreed without hesitation, believing it was simply a polite gesture between old acquaintances. Together they crossed the ballroom until they stopped beside Audrey's table. Audrey looked up first. Her expression remained calm and genuinely courteous. "Hello, Ethan," she said with a gentle smile. "It has been a while." There was no bitterness in her voice. No hidden accusation. Only simple kindness. Somehow that made Ethan even more uncomfortable. "It certainly has," he replied. "You look, well." Audrey thanked him sincerely. Madison introduced herself with warmth, and Audrey responded just as graciously, congratulating them on their engagement after noticing the ring on Madison's hand. The conversation remained perfectly civil. Ethan had expected hesitation, perhaps even sadness, but Audrey offered neither. She seemed completely untouched by the emotional script he had imagined for weeks. Searching for familiar ground, Ethan glanced toward Alexander. "I do not believe we have met," he said, extending his hand. Alexander stood immediately before returning the handshake with quiet respect. "Alexander Vaughn," he answered. "It is a pleasure to meet you." His tone carried no challenge, no attempt to impress. Ethan introduced himself in return, adding that he and Audrey had known each other many years ago. Audrey simply nodded, neither expanding nor correcting the statement. The silence that followed felt strangely heavy. Hoping to regain control of the conversation, Ethan forced a polite laugh. "I was just telling Madison how determined Audrey always was. I am glad to see life has been kind to you." Audrey met his eyes with the same peaceful expression she had carried all evening. "Life has been full of lessons," she answered. "Some difficult. Most worthwhile." Alexander looked toward her with quiet admiration, saying nothing at all. His silence somehow carried more support than a dozen speeches ever could. Before Ethan could think of another response, the bride's father stepped onto the small stage and gently tapped the microphone. His smile widened as he searched the crowd. "Before we continue," he announced, "there is someone here tonight whom I would especially like to thank for making this celebration possible." As dozens of guests turned toward the stage, the bride's father looked directly at Alexander, and the expression on Ethan's face slowly began to change. The bride's father waited until the applause settled before speaking again, his voice carrying easily through the elegant ballroom. "Every wedding is built on generosity," he said with heartfelt gratitude. "Tonight, my family would like to recognize someone whose kindness made this celebration possible long before any of us gathered here." Curious whispers moved quietly from table to table. Ethan Carter folded his arms, assuming another close relative or longtime family friend was about to be honored. Instead, the bride's father smiled warmly toward Alexander Vaughn. "Alexander," he continued, "thank you for believing in my daughter and son-in-law when they're small. Business was nothing more than a dream. Without your encouragement, your investment, and your guidance, this day would have looked very different." The room erupted into applause. Alexander immediately shook his head with an embarrassed smile, rising only because everyone around him encouraged him to stand. He thanked the family with a simple nod before gesturing toward the newly married couple, silently reminding everyone that the evening belonged to them. Yet the applause continued. Several guests smiled knowingly, as though they had expected this moment all along. Ethan stared without blinking. Madison Harper looked at him with quiet confusion. "Investment," she whispered. Before Ethan could answer, another guest standing near the stage laughed warmly into the microphone. "You are being far too modest, Alexander. Half the people in this room still do not know who you are." Light laughter spread through the ballroom. Alexander looked almost uncomfortable with the attention, but the bride's father continued with genuine admiration. "For those who have not had the privilege of meeting him before tonight, Alexander Vaughn is the founder and chairman of Vaughn Capital Partners. His company has helped hundreds of family businesses grow across the country, and his foundation has quietly supported schools, hospitals, and community programs for years without asking for recognition." The ballroom fell into a different kind of silence. It was the silence that followed unexpected truth. Ethan felt the words settle heavily inside his chest. Vaughn Capital Partners. The name finally connected with dozens of articles, interviews, and business reports he had read over the past several years. It was one of the most respected investment firms in the country. The company managed projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars and was known for backing entrepreneurs long before they became successful. Ethan had once dreamed of presenting his own company to that firm, believing that even a brief meeting with its founder would be almost impossible to secure. And now that same man was standing beside Audrey with effortless humility, smiling as though none of those accomplishments mattered nearly as much as the people around him. Madison slowly turned toward Audrey, her expression filled not with envy but genuine surprise. Audrey simply applauded with everyone else, looking at Alexander with quiet pride instead of amazement. It was obvious she had known exactly who he was all along, yet she had never treated his success as the most important thing about him. Alexander finally accepted the microphone for only a moment. "Thank you," he said gently. "But tonight belongs to two people beginning a beautiful life together. I am grateful that Audrey and I could celebrate with all of you." He returned the microphone almost immediately and reached naturally for Audrey's hand. She smiled back with the same calm warmth that had followed her throughout the evening. There was no dramatic announcement, no attempt to impress anyone, only the quiet confidence of two people completely comfortable with the lives they had built together. Standing only a few feet away, Ethan realized that everything he had expected to happen that evening had unfolded in exactly the opposite direction, and for the first time since their marriage ended, he understood that the woman he believed he had left behind had quietly walked far beyond his reach. The applause gradually softened until only the music remained, filling the ballroom with a gentle melody that somehow sounded different now. Nothing in the room had changed, yet everything felt transformed. Ethan Carter stood in complete silence, his thoughts louder than the conversation surrounding him. For years he had measured success by titles, salaries, and admiration from strangers. He had convinced himself that walking away from Audrey Sinclair had been a necessary sacrifice on the road to becoming the man he wanted to be. Tonight, standing only a few feet away from her, he finally understood what success looked like when it was built on character instead of pride. Audrey had never returned to prove him wrong. She had simply continued becoming the woman she was always capable of being. Alexander Vaughn quietly leaned toward her and asked whether she would like another glass of sparkling water before the dancing began. Audrey smiled and thanked him. He walked away for less than a minute before returning with 2 glasses, handing hers to her first without a word. The gesture was small enough that most people never noticed it, yet Ethan did. Years earlier, Audrey had spent countless evenings making certain he never had to ask for anything. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped noticing those quiet acts of care. Alexander seemed to notice them naturally. Madison Harper watched the couple for another moment before gently turning toward Ethan. "She seems genuinely happy," she said softly. There was no jealousy in her voice, only honesty. Ethan nodded almost automatically. For the first time all evening, he did not search for an excuse or another explanation. He simply answered, "Yes. She does." The words carried more truth than anything he had said that night. Across the ballroom, the newly married couple invited everyone onto the dance floor. Friends gathered beneath the warm lights while laughter returned to the room. Audrey accepted Alexander's hand, and together they joined the celebration without drawing attention to themselves. They danced slowly, smiling more at each other than at the crowd around them. Their happiness did not ask anyone to admire it. It simply existed. Ethan realized that was the difference. He had spent years trying to be seen. Audrey had spent those same years learning how to live. As the evening drew closer to its end, guests began collecting coats and saying their goodbyes. Audrey embraced the bride, thanked the groom's parents for a beautiful celebration, and wished the families every happiness before walking toward the entrance beside Alexander. Just before they reached the doors, Ethan quietly called her name. Audrey turned with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the evening. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan offered a sincere smile that carried none of the confidence from earlier that night. "I am glad you are doing well," he said. Audrey held his gaze for a second before answering with gentle kindness. "I truly hope you are too." There was no triumph in her voice. No hidden resentment. No desire to revisit the past. She simply meant what she said. Alexander waited patiently beside her, giving her all the time she needed without interrupting the moment. Audrey reached for his hand, and together they stepped through the ballroom doors into the cool evening air. The sound of laughter slowly faded behind them as the doors closed. Ethan remained where he was, watching the reflection of the chandeliers shimmer across the polished floor. He had entered the wedding believing someone else would leave carrying regret. Instead, he discovered that dignity never needed revenge, peace never needed applause, and the greatest victory was never winning someone back. It was becoming someone who no longer needed to look back at all.